All right, we are recording. So, welcome everyone to Healing Heart Connections' second ever interview. I'm Sarah Harper, and this is Blair Thurston. Blair, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. So my name is Blair. I work in private practice right now as a therapist, specializing in helping people who love someone with an addiction navigate that space of how do I show up for someone when they're struggling with an addiction? What does that mean for me? What are ways to best support? What's the difference between support versus enabling? What is healthy support versus unhealthy support? And really helping guide people in that sphere.
Wow, yeah, those are some great questions that I definitely want to follow up on, right? I guess first, maybe just for folks who maybe aren't so familiar, how do you define addiction?
Ooh, that's a good question. In so I volunteered for a little bit at the Betty Ford Children's Program, and this is the definition that just popped into mind. And so, in very simple terms, you could say it's when someone needs more and more of something and they can't stop. Um, there are a lot of different definitions about what would characterize addiction, but we can say, if we're talking about substance abuse, someone who who needs a substance in order to feel normal, someone who needs a substance in order to get through the day, and then when they do try to stop, there might be physiological withdrawal symptoms. They might try to stop on their own, but they can't. There's a quality to of continuing to use the substance despite persistent negative outcomes, and yeah, we'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, that was beautiful. That was better than I could have done. Thank you. And so I actually didn't realize you primarily focused on folks who love someone with an addiction, because I know that before you were in private practice, you were working at like an inpatient treatment center from like a family model, correct?
So, yes, I was working at an addiction treatment center called Cedar, and I was running the family program there. And so, my primary role at Cedar was to support the family members who had a loved one in treatment. It's interesting that you say, I thought you were working primarily with addiction. Because while I wasn't working primarily with those who were struggling with substance abuse, there's a theme of codependency that fits actually very nicely into an addiction framework. When working with the families, I would often say that while your loved one might be addicted to a substance, there's a dynamic going on where you are actually addicted to your loved one. And so a lot of the processes are similar in working with family members who love someone with an addiction but aren't actually addicted to a substance themselves, because they experience a similar process of increase in anxiety, like increase in physiological arousal. Maybe I don't hear from them for a while, from my loved one for a while. I get really, really anxious. In order to alleviate my own anxiety, I'm going to engage in behaviors that have negative outcomes. So it could be, I'm going to pick up the phone and I'm going to call them 15 times. I'm going to call and call and call until I hear from them. And once I hear from them, then I feel my entire nervous system relax. And then after I feel myself relax, now I go into this shame spiral of, I can't believe I just engaged in that behavior. I don't even recognize myself. This feels out of alignment with my values and who I am. I feel really uncomfortable. And now I'm going to engage in another behavior to discharge that internal discomfort that I'm experiencing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's certainly something that I've seen in folks. That pattern sounds very familiar, right?
Mhm.
And I think it can be so hard, so I've heard, for example, like addiction is a family disease.
Yes.
I've heard that. And when I thought about that initially, like when I heard that, because I'm coming from an attachment lens,
Yeah.
I was sort of thinking about how the ways that family dynamics could sort of produce addiction as a coping mechanism. But what you're talking about sounds a little bit different. It's almost like the way the addiction infects the family afterwards.
Yes, I love that you brought up the concept of addiction as a family disease, because we have to look at. It's very easy to point the finger of at like, let's just look at the person who's struggling with the substance abuse and not pay attention to the ways that we're showing up or the ways that we're perpetuating unhealthy behavior. But when we talk about addiction as a family disease, one of the things that I guess that I would mean by that is, so say that the person who's struggling with the addiction gets sober, they get well, and they come back into the family system. If the other family members don't shift as well, if they don't look inward at themselves and start doing some of their own healing work, then there's a strong risk of inadvertently pushing that person in early recovery back into an addictive pattern, because I identify as being the family member of an addict. And it, on an unconscious level, I might actually perpetuate them being in the sick role because it's more comfortable for me, because I know how to show up when this person is in the addict role. But what we see is that once that person who's in the like in the role of the addict starts to get well and starts to get sober, and starts to do their own inner work, that can actually create a bit of an identity crisis for other people in the family, because they've been so disconnected from themselves and so conditioned to just focus on the person who's not doing well, that when the person does start doing well, they might have to change the way that they identify. So if they can't identify anymore as the mother of an addict or the father of an addict or the sister or the brother of an addict, there's my cat. Then it means that they're faced with this uncomfortable question of, who am I? Who am I when this person is well? If I've been so used to defining myself by like in relation to them when they're not well.
Yeah, fear, it sounds like, and loss of identity. In your experience, how does this sort of what you described as like codependency, how does that get started in a family? And
Yes.
does it always happen with addiction? Is that something that always happens or only sometimes? Why?
Yes, such a great question. Different people have different schools of thought on this. My sense is that if addiction is present, there is going to be at least at least a few people in the periphery of that person who engage in codependent patterns with the addict. The two just kind of go hand in hand with each other. Often how these patterns start like develop in the first place is they might develop in childhood. Say someone comes from an alcoholic home. You have a kid who grows up with an alcoholic parent. They become very attuned to the emotional state of the other person, say of the addicted parent. Their emotional safety depends on being highly attuned to the emotional state of the addicted parent. And so they get into this, they learn these patterns of relating where I'm going to minimize my own needs, minimize my own needs, preferences, desires, and adjust myself to the other person's mood. So it's a pattern where the child becomes disconnected from themselves and hyper attuned to the emotional state of the other person. And then they might even begin to believe that they are on some level responsible for the mood of the other person. So how this could play out is, say the child comes home and they are, I don't know, and the addicted parent says to them, it's your fault I'm in a bad mood, or you did this and yeah, you put me in a bad mood. the kid will begin to learn that they are responsible for the moods of other people and the actions of other people and the behaviors of other people. Maybe if you have a parent that said like, you made me do this, then the kid will begin at a young age to learn that they're responsible for other people's behaviors. So fast forward into adulthood, how this begins to play out in family systems is, for you have the addicted person, and then you have the family members in the periphery, and the family members might feel like they're responsible for the emotional state, the emotional state of the addicted person. And this can be really problematic because it creates an environment where the family members are walking on eggshells around this person, and they're afraid to express what's really going on for them. They're afraid to express their fears, their concerns, because the ultimate fear is, I'm going to say something that's going to make this person relapse. They're going to relapse, and then it's going to be my fault. And that keeps people stuck in this dance.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely sounds like for example, the hypervigilant child will say that really developed as a survival tool, right?
Absolutely.
If you're not hypervigilant to whether or not dad's drunk, bad things could really happen, right? So it's not just this sort of philosophy, it's sort of like mind body. You start, your whole self becomes hyper attuned because that becomes part of survival. So I could see how if someone were to develop a way of interacting with an addict out of a means of survival, that it could be really scary to even think about changing that.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I love that you brought up the survival piece, because it is survival. It's survival. It's emotional safety. And yeah, because as a kid, you don't yet have the means to fully look after yourself. Um, so we carry these survival patterns into adult relationships. And how this shows up in addiction is specifically like around boundary setting. It can be very, very challenging for family members to set boundaries with their loved ones, because the fear is, I set a boundary and they don't respond in a way that I'm hoping for, and then it's my fault. If they get mad, it's my fault. So we really want to start teasing this out. And one of the places where I really start to hone in with my clients is this concept that each person is responsible for their own actions, their own emotions, their own behaviors, their own thoughts, and telling someone really point blank that there is nothing that you can do or say that will make someone relapse. If someone relapses, that is on them. Yes, addiction is a disease, and there is a choice component to whether or not they decide to pick up that first drink. And so when we can start empowering the members of the system to start changing the way that they relate and stop being complicit in these addictive patterns, then we can start to change the family system. But that starts with the family members feeling empowered enough to start expressing their truth, to start advocating for what they want, to stop allowing themselves to be walked all over like doormats. There's this major imbalance that happens in relationships in addicted families, where it's like this one directional arrow is just pointing to the one person who's struggling with the addiction, and everything is about them and everything is about them. And one of the ways that we start disrupting that dynamic is we start making everything not about the addict anymore, and we start creating space for the family members to advocate for their own emotional health and well-being, because so often they've been completely disconnected from themselves, and there's this feeling of the chaos of the other person's life time and time again trumps what I want to do in my life. And so I don't feel like there's space for me to express what it is that I want. Yeah.
This is so powerful because I feel like, sort of as above, so below, in a way that that one directional arrow gets pointed at the addict and the family system. I think it does in the larger sort of like psychological world. Like when we think about addiction, everything that I read, not everything, but so much of what I read is about the addict, right? Like I came on here prepared to ask you, like, what do you think about harm reduction versus AA and things like that? I might still get to that, but I think this paradigm shift that you're bringing is so uh, crucial. It's paradigm shifting. It's so rich to
Mm-hmm.
say, okay, we're not going to just point the finger this one way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I could think of a lot of reasons why that might happen, right? There's, you love and care about the person, so you don't want them to relapse. Or if someone's actively using, I've definitely heard this fear of, well, if I don't just keep giving them money, they're going to die on the streets, right? So I think the example of the child, I think, is hard because children don't have a lot of power in a family system when there's addiction, right? But let's say someone's watching who either they have a partner who's actively engaged in an addiction or a child who's actively engaged in an addiction. What would you say to them if they're just so lost and they don't know what to do?
Okay, this is so good. So let's say it's a partner. One thing that I would pay attention to is, are you trying harder than they are to get them sober?
Ooh, okay.
Mhm. And if so, look at that. Um, okay. We can, at the end of the day, we can only control ourselves. We cannot, we can't force someone to get sober if they don't want to. And so what we do then is we focus on what we can control, which is ourselves. And if the other person isn't going to change or isn't going to shift, then the impetus is on us to change the way that we show up. So how that can look like is okay. You are a free, autonomous human. You can do whatever you want. And if you choose to continue drinking in the house, I'm going to leave. And if you're struggling with a partner who is, yeah, engaging in substances, pay attention to how you feel in the relationship. Pay attention to what it is you can control, what you are willing to live with, and your partner's level of motivation. Do they want to change? Do they want to get better? Are they still really ambivalent? And if they are really ambivalent, are you okay with being with a partner who's ambivalent, or is that too detrimental for your well-being, for your mental health?
Yeah.
What you can do is, um, you can, instead of trying to do everything for them, you can create an environment where you can say, hey, I see that you're struggling, and I want you to know that if and when you are ready to get help, I'm here for you. And I'm happy to help you get into a treatment center. I'm happy to help you get whatever, I'm happy to help. As opposed to what we often see is, uh, partners, parents, loved ones trying so hard to find the perfect treatment center, trying so hard to find the perfect therapist to fix their loved one who has the addiction, who doesn't even really want to get better.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And I would say, add on to that, watch their actions rather than their words,
Yes.
right? Because someone can be saying, I want to get sober, I want to get sober. But if there's no follow through on the action consistent through time,
Yes.
right? And if the words and actions aren't lining up, pay attention to the actions.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And
Uh,
so, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, paying attention to themes of engagement. It is okay if there are relapses along the way. What matters is, if there's a relapse, are they willing to get back, engage in treatment? Are they willing to jump back on the bandwagon? Or are they not engaged in the treatment process at all? Are they waiting for you to save them? If they are waiting for you to save them, then there's not a great prognosis there.
Right. And how alluring to, if someone, you know, to if someone, it's almost like they're inviting you to step into the role of the savior,
Mhm.
which sounds very enticing, I think.
Yes. So back to addiction as a family disease and themes of codependency, we pay attention to what is each person getting out of this. So the addict gets to have a savior. They get to have someone who, at the end of the day, they know is going to come and rescue them from the chaos of their lives, and so they don't actually need to be held accountable for their behaviors. And then the other person, say it's the family member, they get to feel important. They get to feel like they have a mission. They get to feel like they are the special person who is always going to be there to protect their loved one. But what happens is this ends up creating a very disempowering dynamic where that fosters a sense of dependence, where the addict begins to believe that they need someone to save them, and the family member perceives the addicted person as being weak or a victim, or like they're fragile. That's a big thing. They're too fragile. They're not going to be able to make it. If I don't step in, they're not going to be able to make it. And it creates this very disempowering dynamic. Whereas perhaps a more empowering stance could be, I see that you're struggling, and I know that you are so capable of figuring this out. I've seen how resilient you are. I've seen how much you've been able to accomplish. And I know deep within me that you are going to be able to get through this. Um,
That feels so different, even like in my whole body hearing that. You
mhm.
know, just I felt, you know, I know you weren't speaking to me, I'm not addicted, but like it just, even just hearing that, it was sort of like, oh, you know, I can do this. Blair believes in me, right? And that how powerful that can be.
Absolutely. I believe in you. I know you can do this.
Mhm.
I'm here to cheer you along every step of the way. I love you. I love you, and I can't do it for you.
Right. Right. And so I would love to hear more about one of the questions you said in the beginning is, what's the difference between a helping relationship and an enabling relationship?
Mhm.
So
Yes.
how do you discern? How would someone in the throes of this discern what's going on?
Great question. A rule of thumb question that I would pose is, are you doing something for this person that they could be doing for themselves? And if so, maybe get curious about why. Are you doing it? Are you doing it because you don't think that they can do it? Are you doing it because it makes you feel good? Often there's a lot of fear, or even we just get crystallized into these patterns of, it's my role to just take care of everything. It's easier for me to take care of everything. I'll just do it.
Mhm.
And what happens is we end up, when we find ourselves in that space, we end up robbing the addicted person of the ability to develop the life skills that are necessary for maintaining sobriety. We have to allow the addicted people to take responsibility for their own lives. Sure, it might be easier for us to call the doctor and schedule a doctor's appointment for them, and they could easily do that as well. And
Mhm.
so as we're looking at that, what's the difference between healthy support versus unhealthy support? Are you doing something for them that they could be doing for themselves? Another question I would pose is this decision supporting their addiction or supporting their recovery? And how this can look is, often if a family member is maybe giving money to supposedly go to rent, but then that money keeps disappearing, stop giving them money, or pay the landlord directly.
Mhm.
Cut out your family member as the middleman. Um, and then something I would add too is, how do you feel about this help that you're offering, and use your own internal guidance system as information. So, for example, am I giving help that I don't really want to give, that I'm going to end up feeling resentful about afterwards? pay attention to that. If you are giving maybe financial help that you're doing because you feel like you should, but you don't actually want to, then don't. Um, feel into what feels good for you. So, for example, maybe it doesn't feel aligned or okay for you to provide financial support in this way. However, you do feel willing to drive them to AA meetings 2 or 3 times a week. That feels like support that you're happy to give. At the end of the day, as you're going to sleep at night, are you going to find yourself feeling like resentful and this sense of like internal conflict about the way that you engaged in behavior, or are you going to go to sleep feeling like at peace with the help that you offered, knowing that it came from a genuine place of this is something that I really want to offer because I love this person, not out of a place of fear of if I don't do this they might relapse and then it's my fault.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. I've been, if I'm looking down, I'm not scrolling my phone, I'm like writing notes of questions that I want to ask you based on things that you've said. And I have like 5 right here. So, but, so, but, but I'll start with, so something I've heard from a lot of people is, how do I know what I feel? How do I know if I'll feel resentful or not? How do I know where my boundaries are? Because so I'm thinking specifically of partners because I do couples work as well as individual. And so in the couple situation, I've definitely heard, I don't know. How do I learn what I think and feel? How do I know if I'm going to be resentful? Where are my boundaries? Like what should I've had people say, tell me what my boundaries should be. Right. So what do you say to folks in that situation?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Really, really great question. So when you have two people who love each other, one is maybe, so we'll say this is a codependent relationship. One of the hallmarks of being in a codependent relationship is um, one person or both people are totally disconnected from their own feelings and hyper attuned to the feelings of the other person. And part of the way that this happens is their lives become so enmeshed with each other. There's so much overlap between the two people that perhaps there isn't space for them to really figure out who they are independently of the relationship. So things that I would look at are there other places in your life where needs are being met, or are you looking to the relationship to be everything for you? So things that I would explore are social needs. Do you have friends outside of your relationship? Social needs, like spiritual connection. What does your connection to a higher power look like? And this could also include things like spending time in nature, being outside, being in the mountains, anything that brings you inner peace and helps you feel connected to something bigger than yourself. I also look at where where are you getting a sense of self-worth in your life? What is giving you a sense of self-worth outside of the relationship? That can be work, volunteering, that can be just working with a therapist. Coming back to your question, for many people don't know what they feel. Many people don't know what they feel and don't know what they want. And so my recommendation would be spend some time independently of the relationship, getting to know yourself again. What do you actually like to do? What are your hobbies? What are the parts of yourself that you have lost touch with? Maybe what are things that you like to do as a kid? What used to bring you joy? What areas of your life would you invest in if you weren't in this relationship? And so really spending time getting to know yourself again, because it's okay if you have lost yourself in the relationship. We see that often. And relationships can get really confusing. So yeah, my recommendation would be um, work on building up other areas of your life. So, friends, spiritual connection, self worth, work, creative endeavors, and get to know yourself again. Engage in hobbies outside of your relationship so that you can see how you feel there and then bring that energy into the relationship. And that can help.
Yeah, wow. I think earlier you gave what may have been the best definition of codependency that I've heard, because it's like a buzzword. It's sort of in vogue. It's on BuzzFeed article, and a lot of people say codependency, and I don't think anyone's checking to see if they know what they mean. But I think the explanation you gave was just beautiful,
Mhm.
very clear. This is what codependency is, right? Discerning. You mentioned the role of spirituality, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about, so for example, AA, I know or NA, any of the spin-offs of AA, if you will, that, there's this sense of you have to turn yourself over to a higher power. Harm reduction doesn't necessarily take that perspective. So what do you see as the role of spirituality and uh, healing from the family disease of addiction?
Yeah, great question. So I don't know if this is specific to AA or 12 step, but my own personal sense of the role of spirituality in recovery is, are you able to connect with a bigger purpose for your life? Are you able to zoom out and see, maybe I had to go through this. Maybe I had to experience the hell of addiction so that I could learn the lessons that I need to learn for the maturation of my soul. Maybe I had to go through this so that I can use these lessons to help someone down the line in the future. So, um, so I believe the relationship is, can you make meaning out of this? Can you relate to your addiction in a way that you can see it, maybe even as a gift, which might be difficult in the moment, but can you connect to something greater than yourself that gives you a sense of meaning and purpose and desire to get sober? Can you connect to um, can you connect to the possibility of what a life worth living might look like? And then I think there's a big surrender component, and I think the surrender component is very spiritual, of giving up control, and handing my life over to a greater good that I might not even know what it is, but I'm going to choose to trust that it's out there and there's something greater for me in this life.
Yeah. And I would say not even letting go of control, but letting go of the illusion of control,
Yeah,
right?
there you go.
And this is something I talked with, and I said this in the other interview too, but I think it's so present early in this pandemic, March, April, May of last year, which we're coming up on the coronaversary, which is wild. Uh, so I'm trying to get my doc cohort to like have a coronaversary celebration. It's not happening, but I keep trying to make it happen. Anyway, so last year, March, April, May, there was this deep sort of existential shock, like sort of across my caseload, right? Everyone went into lockdown. All of a sudden, we couldn't go to the grocery store without wearing a mask. All of a sudden, we can't see our family in person. We have to Zoom. And there was this giant loss of control, right? And anxiety skyrocketed. And one of the things that I just found myself telling my clients over and over is things weren't certain before either. You just could trick yourself into believing that they were, right? So we don't have control over it. And like you were saying before, we only have control of ourselves. And even then, only, I think, to the extent that we have self-awareness, that to the extent that we are aware of ourselves is the extent to which we have free will. But a lot of what we do is, subconscious or biological as well. So, we can barely control ourselves, but we have no control over a global pandemic or a spouse using heroin or any of it.
Absolutely.
So it's to me, it's sort of like just telling the truth of the situation.
Mm-hmm. It's it's blasting away the illusion of control. We never had control in the first place. And now that we really know that we don't have control, how do we adapt? How can we flow with that? I
Mm-hmm.
don't remember who said this. It was one of my professors in grad school, but someone said once that flexibility is the hallmark of mental health. And that has always stuck out with me. And I think ties in nicely to this concept of how can you adapt and flow through life without holding on so tightly? How can you release control and dance with life, move with life, adapt with life as as we're flowing in this ever-changing river.
Yeah, and actually, so I don't know because so for our viewers at home, Blair and I went to the same marriage and family therapy program. So I don't we had the same professors. I don't necessarily remember which professor said that, but I will say that in my doc program, I've been introduced to the psychodynamic diagnostic manual, which is an evidence-based, legitimate alternative to the DSM. And right front and center in that book, they define mental health as flexibility, adaptability, and ability to deeply connect with the other in a sustained and healthy way. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Love.
And then dis-ease or mental illness is then defined as rigidity, stereotypy, compulsive repetitive behaviors of self-sabotaging action, and sort of lower level coping mechanisms like splitting or externalizing, like the bad is out there and the good is in here and it's coming to get me or something like that. So all that to say, yes, I absolutely agree that flexibility and adaptability are hallmarkers of health. And any area of our lives where there's very rigid, inflexible behavior and movement, there's something to sort of work on there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, speaking of mental health, just in general, what do you see as the relationship between mental illness and use? Right? Because I've worked with people, for example, who are bipolar and will use certain substances when they're manic and certain substances when they're depressed. I certainly know people who use to cope with anxiety or depression, or maybe, I mean, I guess maybe what comes first, the chicken or the egg, or how do you see the relationship between addiction and mental illness?
Yeah, great question. I believe that at the end of the day, we are all just trying to feel good. We're all just trying to feel good to escape pain, escape suffering. And some of us have learned to do that in more adaptive ways or less adaptive ways. So, yes, I absolutely think that there's a self medication um, process going on where maybe maybe they're say you have someone who struggles with anxiety and social anxiety, going out with friends, and they learn that when they drink around friends, that anxiety goes down and they feel more calm. And so over time, using that, like reinforcing alcohol as a coping mechanism to deal with anxiety over and over and over again, can lead to a dependence on the substance. I also want to say that not there is a strong genetic component to addiction, and so you can have someone who is a very heavy drinker for many years, but they don't develop an addiction. And on the flip side, you can have someone who hasn't been drinking for very long, but that hi Charlie.
Okay.
Oh, that's so sweet. Yeah, maybe someone who hasn't been drinking very long, and the alcohol triggers this what might we call it, the addiction gene, where once they start they feel like they can't stop. So anyway, so going back to your question, so what's the relationship between mental health and addiction? um, I think that when people are trying to feel better and they don't know other alternatives, and we grow up and we live in a culture where substance use is so normalized, that the accessibility of substance use often it's almost like gives people an opportunity to bypass learning healthier mechanisms for dealing with difficult emotions. And so maybe people are underdeveloped in learning specific skills that can help them feel better, when substances are easy and so readily available, and they work in the short term. So
Yeah, that I mean that's part of the problem is that substances work in the short term but make the problem worse in the long term, right? And I want to emphasize too what you said about learning skills. So generally speaking, I have a bit of resistance to the idea of therapy or life coaching as like you go there to learn skills, but that is a legitimate component because coping, as you said, with these complex, intense emotions is a skill. It's something that you can learn, first of all. So if you don't know it now, you can learn it. And second of all, you often have to be taught, right? So in a healthy home, your parents teach you when you're very young and you just grow up knowing how to do it. But if you didn't get that, then very often you need to intentionally go learn this thing and then you can do it, right?
mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely. So, for example, let's take the skill of sitting with a difficult emotion.
mm-hmm.
So, if we grow up in a home where we get the messaging either explicitly or implicitly, don't feel sad, don't feel angry, don't feel hurt, then we shut down that part of ourselves, and we don't allow ourselves to feel those things. And yet, part of being human is feeling the full spectrum of human emotion. And so, perhaps the skill of sitting with emotion is, instead of resisting and pushing away and avoiding the uncomfortable emotion, what if we were able to approach the emotion from a more gentle, welcoming, curious stance and just notice it? Say like welcome in the sadness, welcome in the anxiety, notice it, be with it, be see what it has to say. Maybe it just wants some space to be felt. And the amazing thing about this too is, so emotion is just energy, and energy when observed shifts, it transmutes, it changes. And so if you observe the sadness or the fear or the anxiety for long enough, it will change. It will evolve into something different. Maybe it dissipates, maybe it passes, but we don't give it the opportunity to do that if we are constantly pushing it away, saying, I don't want to look there, I don't want to look there, I don't want to look there.
Yeah, I have so much to say about that. It's so the first thing that came to mind is Rumi's poem, "The Guest House." Are you
Yes.
familiar? Right. So this being human as a guest house, and it sort of describes our different emotions as visitors that come in, and whoever shows up at the door, we're a good host, and we give them tea, and then we send them on their way with whatever comes in, right? And I tend to think too that emotions are often messages from us,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's just our prefrontal cortex, which has all these words and language, but then we have a whole rest of a brain and a whole rest of a body that also is alive and has wisdom. And I think sometimes our emotions bring us messages, bring
Mm-hmm.
us wisdom from these other parts of ourselves, that if we are able to welcome them in, we can listen to the message and glean from that wisdom and then act accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We could say emotions are messages from the subconscious body, wisdom from the body. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is such a skill to both not resist the emotion, let it come in, and not cling to it and feed it, right? Just that middle, how would you describe that like middle place?
Oh, that's such an interesting concept, that you brought up. So in the treatment center where I worked before, there was a phrase that got thrown around a lot that was, um, you want to sit in the suck, but you don't want to stay there. So I think there's this art of welcoming in the really uncomfortable emotion, sitting with it for a moment, acknowledging that it's there, and then choosing to not stay there anymore, or choosing to shift in a way. So, choosing to engage in a behavior that might help bring you out of that place. So, for example, going for a run, or dancing, or shaking. I'm a big fan of shaking. Or
There's a lot of good evidence-based reasons to advocate shaking specifically. It's very
totally
effective. Mm-hmm.
from. Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think you bring up a great point, Sarah, of what's the relationship between not wanting to avoid the emotion, but also not wanting to like totally spiral into it and stay stuck in this fear, shame, pain land for a really long time. And I don't know. I wonder if that's an individual process that each person gets to decide for themselves.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
do think there's some relationship between it is important to acknowledge the emotion, create space for it, and then choose to not stay there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Pema Chodron also, she's a Buddhist nun who writes, philosophy and such. Highly recommend. She's very great. So she has a practice that she recommends that's essentially sitting in the stuck, right? But enveloping it in your own love.
Hmm.
So first of all, the biggest part of you is your love, not the suck. And then
Mm-hmm.
and then soothing the suck with your own love the way a good mother soothes a crying infant, right? A good
Mm-hmm.
mother doesn't shake the infant and say that it's bad for crying, right? A good mother would pick
Mm-hmm.
up an infant and soothe it, and that's sort of creating that space for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I love that. Mhm.
So if
I
someone,
think that also hits on,
go ahead.
oh, okay. I was going to say, I think that also hits on the notion that at our core, we are love. At our core, we are love. We are compassion. We are um, calm. But yeah, we have this inherent goodness that is our true nature. I believe this at least, that the core essence of all humans is good. And so in that Pima Chodron visualization that you were sharing, it sounds like she's encouraging people to tap into the core essence, the love that is within you, knowing that that is the greatest part of you, and then envelop
Right.
the stuff with it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the safety, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
we don't have we can't control the outside. There might be a global pandemic, but we can create a loving space within ourselves that will empowers us to be flexible and adaptable no matter what happens, right? Going back to mental illness and addiction, if someone is struggling with both,
Mm-hmm.
what do they do? Like I've worked at places where they were like, we won't see anyone for therapy until they've done detox. I've seen other places where it's like, well, if we address the underlying mood issue, then the addiction doesn't need to happen anymore. So like, what's your sort of opinion on the healing order or process?
My personal perspective is that the substance use needs to be addressed first. And so once the substance use is addressed, then we can start diving more into the underlying mental health concerns. But until the substance use is under control, I don't believe that it will be as productive or productive at all to start like to really dive into the mental health stuff,
Okay.
because there's too much instability.
Yeah, yeah. So I am going to ask the question of, AA versus harm reduction versus like, what are your thoughts on the different ways of healing from addiction?
Yeah, great question. So my personal perspective is I honor the autonomy of I honor the autonomy of anybody that I work with. And so if someone is in a place where they truly don't want to give up substances and their use is dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
then yes, I would encourage the harm reduction route, because I'm honoring their autonomy for their life. That person gets to decide how they want to live their life, and so if they are saying I'm not ready, I'm not able to fully give up substances, then I'll say, okay, I'll meet you where you are. Let's explore harm reduction.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if someone is in a place where they are they have reached perhaps their rock bottom and they're like, I'm done with substances. I I know that this is I know that I know that I'm done. I've reached that point. Then I would recommend AA for helping, for the community element, for helping support them in their decision for abstinence. But I think that's the key point, is they are making the decision for abstinence. And so if that's what you want, then I think this is a community that can be really supportive for you. But yeah, you might find some people say like only AA, no harm reduction. But I've also heard people say people who are in recovery now say that when they were earlier on in their recovery process, I've had people say that during that time, if I didn't have the drugs or alcohol to help me cope, I might have killed myself.
Yeah.
And so I honor that. I honor that person's wisdom. I truly think that people will know when they are ready to stop using. And when they are ready to stop using, there is so much help available for them. But they get to decide. We don't get to decide for them. We do get to decide how we show up in relationship with them while they are continuing to use, but they get to decide where they are in their process.
Yeah. Powerful. So I'm trying to be conscious of time. I feel like I could just talk to you about this for hours and hours and hours, and maybe we can have a part two at some point. But I do want to touch on, I've had clients of mine contemplate, is it time for me to cut off this person, right? If their use is just out of control, really negatively impacting the family system, like at what point do I cut them off? What does the cutoff look like? And how do I deal with my own grief and guilt around that?
Yeah, really, really great question. I'm noticing I'm saying really great question after every question you ask.
I'm a professional question asker.
You're a professional question asker. Yes. How does one draw a boundary? Like, what does that process look like? What if they're not ready? So what I would recommend is start small. We don't have to go from not having any boundaries to straight up ultimatums. So start small. Maybe it looks like saying, if you use in the house, then I need you to go live somewhere else. So in that scenario, you're engaging in the relationship still. You're not cutting them out of your life completely, and there's a consequence for if there's use. And let's see, other examples could be maybe around finances. So if there's a relapse, then I will withhold financial support in this way. So my recommendation would be start small with boundary setting. Boundary setting is a skill. Boundary setting is a muscle. And so if we're not used to doing it in relationship, it will feel challenging. And so I would recommend starting small and then having support, having people that you can check in with. This is where groups like Al-Anon can be really helpful, for having a community of people to support you in holding firm to your boundary. Because also boundaries do not mean anything if we don't enforce a consequence. So something to be conscientious of if you are trying to set boundaries with your loved ones. Before you do that, make sure that make sure that there's a consequence if that boundary is crossed, and B, make sure that you are able to follow through on that consequence. Because if you're not able to, then that's a good indication that we should explore another boundary that might make more sense for you. And so Having support is so important for family members and for those who are in relationship with the person with the addiction, because like anybody who has been in relationship with someone knows that maybe you have all this courage to have a difficult conversation on your own, and then you're sitting with the person and you're face to face with them, and it's so hard. And so having support and people that you can talk to, whether it's a therapist, whether it is Al-Anon, whether it's friends, some sort of community, but people who can help encourage you to stay strong in your boundary setting and take it
Yeah.
small.
Yeah. Wow. This is amazing. You just have so much knowledge.
Thank
Uh,
you.
I'm curious, just, well, I guess maybe first I'll say, what have we not talked about that you would like to talk about, that you would like to share before we end?
Mm-hmm. Um, hmm. I just want to emphasize how important it is for the other people in the system to prioritize themselves. Um, so yeah, how important it is for people in the system to prioritize themselves. Because often too, like the person who's struggling with the addiction, they might like having all of the like focus and energy on them, but they also might not. Sometimes they feel like especially in early recovery, we see this all the time. People in early recovery coming out of treatment, and the families are all just like, are they going to relapse? Are they not going to relapse? And they feel like they're under a microscope, and there can be this very like micromanagey energy from the family members towards the person in early recovery
I'm
that,
feeling anxious just thinking about it. Like all this.
yeah, it's just like it's not helpful, and it's a trauma response from the family members. They like, when there's addiction, there's trauma, and so the family members have often been traumatized as a result of the person's addiction. And so it makes so much sense that when the person is in early recovery, the family members are going to be on high alert. Am I safe? Am I not safe? But what happens is that this creates a really tense dynamic where the family members are just focusing on the person with the addiction, and they might be asking questions like, did you go to meetings? What did you talk about in meeting? Did you have any cravings today? How many cravings did you have? And it can feel very overwhelming. And so these are the moments in early recovery where it's of the utmost importance for the family members to have other people that they can talk to who's not the person in early recovery about their emotions. We don't want to put the family's anxiety on the person in early recovery, because that can happen too. The person in early recovery feels like it's their job to work on both their own sobriety, but then also managing the anxiety of the family. And we don't want to do that. And so for family members, get help, get support, but not from the person who's in recovery. Go to Al-Anon, work with a therapist, talk about your own anxiety, talk about your own identity stuff that is coming up, but get your own support. And because so this is a time where we want to take that like unidirectional arrow off of the person in early recovery and turn the mirror back and put it on the family member. And so this can be a really nice time for there to be a parallel process happening where the person in recovery is working on themselves and the family member is working on themselves. And that means reconnecting with their own emotions, reconnecting with their hobbies, reconnecting with their friends, all the areas of their life that they've put on hold as a result of their loved one's addiction. Start doing that when your loved one is in the early stages of their recovery. And so you're on this parallel healing path together. And yeah, really emphasizing just focusing on yourself.
Yeah, I'm getting the way it sort of feels to me as like addiction creates this muddled and meshed sort of like emotional like blob. And I feel like you're coming in and you're like separating, you're discerning, you're
Mhm.
creating like boundaries and clarity that creates safety, because the mess is not safe. It's just everyone's, as you say, in the trauma response and repeating the trauma cycle.
Mhm.
But doing it this way, I mean, like how powerful, right? Like if this person's working on recovery, if this person's working on their codependency, and they're both pursuing this in good faith, what a possibility to completely have a different family.
Absolutely.
Have you seen this happen? Is this like a real thing that can happen to people?
Oh yeah. What's funny is what I will often see is for couples that are very enmeshed, very codependent, the person with the addiction gets sober and they start working on themselves, and then the family member realizes like, oh, I'm allowed to focus on me. I'm allowed to prioritize myself. And then there can be this pendulum swing where it goes like a little bit too far in one direction as they're testing the limits of what that independence looks like for them. And then the addicted person is over here like, hey, like, wait, what about me? Don't forget about me. And I think it's important to test the pendulum so that they can find this healthy medium of where they fall in the middle. But absolutely, we do see that, and this is how we see families get better, when when each individual. I guess what I really want to communicate is each individual is responsible for their own mental health. It is not my job to manage your mental health. It's not your job to manage my mental health. That doesn't mean that we can't still show up and help and support each other, but there's a difference of it being my responsibility to make sure that you're happy, as opposed to it being your responsibility to make sure that you're happy, and I'm here to hold space for you in that process.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
It, it's being clear on who's responsible for what. I'm responsible for me. You're
Right.
responsible for you.
Yep. Exactly. Exactly.
And there's a freedom in that.
There's such freedom in that. Um, another comment that I wanted to say is that in in addicted homes, there's so much confusion. We talk about there are these three unspoken rules in addicted homes, which are don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel. And
Ooh. Mm-hmm.
and so we want to start breaking those rules. We want to start working on rebuilding trust. We want to start talking about what's actually going on for us. So many people don't talk about what's going on for them because they're afraid of hurting someone else's feelings, and so
And shame.
they're ashamed. Exactly. And so they don't talk about what's bothering them. We want to start creating a space where it's safe to talk about what's bothering you, and then where it's safe to start feeling emotions too. Feeling emotions without necessarily needing to fix them, without needing to do anything with them, but just allowing ourselves to feel them.
Mm-hmm.
And then one more comment on on help, because um, these addicted relationships are often so confusing. There's a lot of like mind reading that happens, trying to guess what the other person would want. And so stop doing that. Stop trying to guess what the other person wants or what would be helpful for them, and ask directly. So say, um, would, um, would you like me to do this? As opposed to just inserting yourself and doing things for them, ask, would you like me to do this for you? Would this feel helpful? Also checking in with yourself if it's something that you want to do. What I've seen a lot is the family members will say, like, what would feel supportive? What do you want from me? And the person in early recovery might say, like, I don't know. I don't know what I want. I don't know what would be helpful. And so in that case, I would say, great. How about this? So right now you don't know. If and when you do know, ask, like, let me know. I'm here. I'm here, ready and wanting and willing to support. When you figure out what would be helpful for you, ask. I would love to know. And then again, that empowers the other person to take responsibility for asking for what they need without me. Another step in this is I have to trust their answer. I can't just say, I can't just say, okay, they don't know. I'm going to continue to guess. I'm going to continue to guess. I'm going to continue to guess. Trust their answer. Say like, okay, you don't know. I'm here for you when you do know.
Mhm. And when they share what they would like from me, right? I'm allowed to say no.
You're allowed to say no. Exactly. Exactly. I'm so glad that you said that. Um, yeah, I'm so glad that you said that, because the default in these family systems um, is for the family member automatically just like suppress, like minimizing what they want and prioritizing the mental health of the other person. And so I love that you brought that back up. You want to run their requests through your own internal discernment system and see if it's help that you're willing to offer.
Right, because that's part of breaking your own addiction.
That's part of breaking your own addiction. Exactly.
Yeah, and the with the mind reading piece, when I have some couples, and I tell them to think of the other person as a black box, which is sort of like, you might recognize, it's like a throwback to the old like behaviorists of like the 1930s and 40s, and that's, you know, when psychology started using rats and cats and things to understand human psychology, because this idea was, well, the mind is a black box. We can't see it, we can't measure it. So
Mm-hmm.
like stuff goes in, we can see what goes in, we can see what goes out, but we can't see what's going on in there. So we just have to study everything else. So I sort of tell clients, yeah, like the other person's a black box. You don't know what they're thinking. You don't know what they're feeling. You have to ask, right? And then there's that thing on that's trending on Twitter. Well, a couple weeks ago, it was trending on Twitter of like, you know, my life changed when I started asking my fiance, do you want to vent or do you want to problem solve? Right?
I haven't heard that. I love that.
And that simple question helps cures like 90% of conversations. Like, you're
Yeah.
upset. Do you want to vent or do you want to problem solve? What do you want from me? You know, and I have couples that will say, you know, I need serious Sarah right now. I need playful Sarah right now. Like, and learning how to use that language within, you know, in that case, the couple system. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Awesome. I love that question. Yeah, we just don't know what other people are thinking unless we ask. And it is incredible how like how much relationship conflict can be resolved when we take the guesswork out of it and we are able to ask directly. And working through the fear that comes up with that too.
because making things explicit can be scary.
Yeah.
Can make you feel very vulnerable, very exposed. And if you're in a family where you've learned that being vulnerable and exposed is dangerous, um, that's a hard thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When, so when is it so dangerous to be, is there ever a point where like the addicted person is so dangerous that it becomes mm, like you might push a client, for example, to separate as opposed to just letting them make their own decision, or do you always just trust their autonomy?
If there are ever like legitimate safety concerns, those take priority. If there's a high risk of death or overdose or yeah, if there are health concern, if there are safety concerns, those always take priority. So um yeah, so that would be an area where I wouldn't necessarily trust a or honor a client's autonomy if they told me that they were going to take their life in that moment. That would be an area where I would intervene. And so I would coach family members on ways to do that too. I talk about let them know that they can do a welfare check if they're really concerned about the safety of their loved one. They can call the police to go check up on the house of the person if they haven't heard from them for a couple of days. If they are actively suicidal, we can put them on a 72-hour hold.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in New York, it's called an MHA. So out here, we also have like mobile crisis.
Okay.
Do you have something like that out in Denver?
I don't know. What
So
is mobile crisis?
it's like, so it's part of the behavioral health division of the hospital, and they
Okay.
have, so they have like therapists like in the office, but they also have therapists that will like, if you call, they'll like come out in a van and they come in pairs and they'll like come to your house and they'll knock on your door and they can talk to you and they can de-escalate you. They can make the decision whether or not to mental health arrest you or not, instead of calling the police.
Oh, I don't know if we have that service out here.
You
That
didn't when I lived out there. I was not sure if just it had been developed since, with Black Lives Matter and everything that's been going on, if that was a thing now. But
if it has been, I'm not aware of it, and it like there's absolutely a need for it, and I can see that that would be a really valuable service.
yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So wow, I have like 12 more things I want to say, but we've already been talking so long, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. Um, Blair, I am so grateful. This was great. This was a great conversation. I think you have so much knowledge and wisdom. I think folks who watch this are really going to benefit from that. I don't know if you want to take a minute to sort of give a personal plug, because I know that you can see people across state lines as a life coach, as can I.
Mm-hmm.
I know you also have like some class that you're teaching coming up. So I don't know if you want to share with folks just if they want to connect with you somehow, how they can do that.
Sure. So yes, so I'm in private practice. I'm an LPC licensed professional counselor in Colorado, and I also have a coaching agreement so that I'm able to see people across state lines for coaching. We could call it life coaching. We could call it family coaching, addiction related coaching. For navigating some of these issues that have come up in conversation with me and Sarah today. And so if you would like to reach out, I am accepting clients. I'd love to work with you. You can check out my website, which is blairthurstoncounseling.com. My email address is blairthurstoncounseling@gmail.com. And oh yeah, and she mentioned I was teaching a class. I am teaching a class. This class isn't on addiction. This is a class on human design. If I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it's an amazing system that I'm very passionate about that teaches people how to make decisions correctly for themselves by tapping into the wisdom of the body. And I would love to see you there. You can find me on Facebook at Blair Thurston Counseling LLC. And I think that's all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Blair. This is a total pleasure. That's all for today. Thank you folks so much for watching and or listening. So once again, I'm Sarah Harper with Healing Heart Connections at healingheartroc.com. I am also accepting new clients, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And I want you to know that I really believe in you. So I am
And wait, Sarah, I didn't get to thank you.